Mark Stevens had always been protective of his secluded lakefront property. A former environmental engineer who had taken early retirement, he had spent the last decade transforming the 5-acre plot into a meticulously maintained ecosystem. The small, crystal-clear lake nestled behind his woodland home was more than just a body of water. It was his personal sanctuary, the living testament to his years of careful conservation and deep respect for nature. The property had been a dream decades in the making. Mark remembered the day he first saw the land overgrown and neglected during a real estate tour 15 years ago. Where others saw an untamed wilderness, he saw potential. Potential for restoration, for creating a delicate balance between human presence and natural habitat. He had spent years removing invasive plant species, reintroducing native vegetation, and carefully managing the lake's ecosystem. His mornings typically began before sunrise. Mark would walk the perimeter of his property, clipboard in hand, noting the subtle changes in vegetation, monitoring the health of the shoreline, and tracking the local wildlife. The deer that occasionally visited, the family of otters that made their home in the far corner of the lake, the various bird species that nested in his carefully maintained woodland, they were all part of his extended family. Solitude was not just a preference for Mark, it was a necessity. After decades of working in high-stress environmental consulting, dealing with corporate bureaucracies and endless meetings, he had carved out this slice of paradise as his ultimate reward. His ex-wife never understood his need for quiet, which was partly why their marriage had ended 15 years ago. But Mark had no regrets. This land was his true companion, his source of peace and purpose. Everything changed the day Karen Thompson moved into the neighboring property. A recent divorcee in her mid-40s, she represented everything Mark had spent years avoiding: noise, chaos, and a complete disregard for environmental boundaries. Where his property was a carefully maintained ecosystem, hers looked like a suburban party venue waiting to happen. At first, the intrusions were minor. A few loud weekend gatherings, music that drifted across the property line, occasional groups of friends parking their expensive SUVs along the shared access road. Mark tried to be patient, hoping that the newcomer would eventually recognize and respect the delicate balance of the area. But Karen seemed to view the entire neighborhood as her personal playground. A self-proclaimed social butterfly with an inexplicable sense of entitlement, she appeared to have no concept of personal boundaries or environmental sensitivity. Her parties grew larger, her music louder, her guests more numerous and less considerate. At first, it was just a few friends, then increasingly large gatherings that spilled beyond her property lines. Disposable cups would appear along the shoreline. Beer bottles would be left scattered in the woods, and the noise would shatter the delicate morning silence Mark had come to cherish. But on that fateful summer Saturday, Karen crossed a line that would spark a legendary neighborhood dispute. What began as another of her typical weekend gatherings would soon become a moment of reckoning. A day when Mark Stevens would remind everyone that his sanctuary was not to be trifled with. The invasion began early that Saturday morning. Mark first noticed if something was wrong when he heard the rumble of multiple vehicles around 9 a.m. Typically, the access road was quiet, with perhaps a single car passing by occasionally. Today, it sounded like a parking lot was being constructed outside his sanctuary. Peering through the carefully trimmed blinds of his study, Mark counted no fewer than 15 vehicles parked along the shared access road. Large SUVs, a couple of sleek sports cars, and even a massive black Escalade with chrome wheels that looked completely out of place in the woodland setting. Portable speakers the size of small refrigerators were being unloaded, along with coolers, inflatable pool toys, and what appeared to be professional-grade catering equipment. By 10 a.m., the first guests began to arrive. They were not the quiet, nature-appreciative types Mark was accustomed to. These were loud, designer-clad individuals who seemed more interested in their social media presence than the beautiful natural environment surrounding them. Women in designer swimsuits took selfies by the lakeside, completely oblivious to the delicate ecosystem they were trampling. Young men in expensive swim trunks cracked open beer cans before noon, tossing their first empties carelessly near the water's edge. Mark watched in mounting horror as over 30 people invaded his lake. The water, which he had spent years keeping pristine, was now a chaotic playground. Expensive cocktails and oversized plastic cups were passed around, leaving rings of condensation on smooth stones Mark had carefully arranged over decades. Inflatable unicorns and oversized beach balls dotted the surface, their garish colors a stark contrast to the natural blues and greens of the lake. At the center of it all was Karen, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a white designer swimsuit that probably cost more than Mark's monthly utility bills. She moved through the crowd like a queen, directing people where to place things, adjusting the positioning of speakers, and ensuring her party was nothing short of Instagram-worthy. When the music started, it was like an assault on Mark's carefully maintained peace. Bass-heavy electronic dance music thundered across the lake, sending ripples across the water's surface. The sound startled a family of ducks that had been nesting near the eastern shore, causing them to scatter in panic. Mark winced. knowing how such disruption could impact the local wildlife. Unable to contain himself any longer, Mark walked down to the lake's edge. He moved carefully, following the path he had maintained for years, each step deliberate. As he approached, several partygoers gave him curious looks, but most were too engrossed in their revelry to pay much attention. "Excuse me," Mark called out, trying to be heard over the music. Karen, however, was busy mixing cocktails and seemed to deliberately ignore him. When he finally reached her, Mark cleared his throat. "This is a private lake," he said firmly, "and you do not have permission to be here." Karen looked up, those oversized sunglasses reflecting Mark's frustrated face. She waved her hand dismissively, cocktail shaker still in her other hand. "It's just a little fun," she shouted over the music. "Don't be such a buzzkill." A roar of laughter erupted from her friends. Some of the younger guests began to mock Mark, mimicking an old man's voice and gestures. The humiliation was complete. His sanctuary, his carefully maintained piece of paradise, had been transformed into a chaotic party venue without his consent. As Mark stood there, rage and helplessness mixing within him, he knew this was far from over. Karen had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. That night, sleep eluded Mark completely. He sat in his study, surrounded by decades of meticulously maintained environmental journals, research notes, and photographs of the lake through the seasons. Each document was a testament to his life's work, a careful chronicle of the ecosystem he had nurtured and protected. The violation of the previous day burned in his mind. Mark pulled out his laptop, his fingers moving with a precision honed by years of scientific research. He began to investigate not just Karen, but potential methods of retaliation that would be both memorable and harmless. His engineering background kicked in. This would be a problem to solve, not an emotional outburst to regret. First, he pulled up the Neighborhood Association bylaws. Mark had always been a stickler for rules, and he knew every line of the community guidelines. While the documents were frustratingly vague about specific lake usage, they were crystal clear about causing genuine harm or damage to property. Whatever he planned would need to be clever, psychological, and completely within the bounds of legality. Social media provided unexpected insights. Karen's profile was a treasure trove of information. Scrolling through her recent posts, Mark discovered her most significant fear: snakes. Not just a mild discomfort, but a full-blown phobia that seemed to dominate her outdoor-related anxiety. Photographs showed her canceling camping trips, backing away from garden areas, and once even leaving a beach party because someone mentioned seeing a snake nearby. A plan began to take shape. Mark's research went deep. He spent hours studying different types of rubber snakes, reading reviews, watching YouTube videos of prank compilations. He wanted realism. Snakes that would create maximum psychological impact, but minimum actual danger. Professional-grade rubber snakes used in film productions caught his attention. These weren't cheap toy replicas, but meticulously crafted replicas that could fool even a careful observer. He created a dedicated spreadsheet tracking potential snake purchases. Different sizes, different species, anacondas, water moccasins, copperheads. Each had specific characteristics that might enhance the psychological impact. Mark approached this with the same methodical approach he once used in complex environmental impact studies. Budget was no object. Mark had lived frugally for years, investing carefully and living well below his means. The money he'd saved from not traveling or maintaining an expensive lifestyle could now be channeled into his most elaborate project yet. Online purchases began to arrive. Each package was carefully inspected, the snakes tested for their realistic appearance and potential water-based deployment. Mark practiced positioning them, understanding water currents, and creating maximum surprise potential. His engineering background proved invaluable. This was essentially a complex psychological deployment strategy. By the end of the week, Mark had assembled an impressive arsenal. 37 rubber snakes in total. Some would float just beneath the surface, others would be strategically placed among rocks and vegetation. He even purchased a few that could be remotely controlled, adding an extra layer of unpredictability. His neighbors might see this as an act of revenge. But to Mark, this was restoration. A carefully planned intervention to reclaim his sanctuary. Just as he had spent years carefully managing invasive species in his ecosystem, he was about to manage the most invasive species of all, Karen and her party crowd. The next late party would be different. Mark allowed himself a rare smile, the first genuine one in weeks. The following weekend arrived with perfect conditions. Mark's meteorological background helped him choose the ideal day, a clear Saturday with temperatures climbing into the mid-80s, virtually guaranteeing another of Karen's late parties. He had been monitoring her social media and neighborhood chatter, confirming that another gathering was imminent. Early that morning, Mark rose before dawn. His preparation was methodical, each movement calculated with the precision of a military operation. He dressed in neutral earth-tone clothing that would blend seamlessly with the surrounding woodland. A lightweight waterproof backpack contained his arsenal of carefully selected rubber snakes. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees as Mark began his deployment. He moved silently around the lake's edge, each step carefully placed to avoid disturbing the natural environment. His years of ecological work had taught him how to move through nature without leaving a trace. Some snakes were positioned to float just beneath the water's surface, their realistic coloration and texture making them nearly indistinguishable from actual aquatic life. Others were carefully draped over rocks, positioned to create maximum surprise. Mark used his understanding of water currents and common swimming patterns to create the most strategic placements. The water moccasin replicas were particularly impressive. Positioned near popular swimming areas, they looked disturbingly real, their scales catching the morning light, positioned in ways that suggested they could start moving at any moment. A few of the more advanced models could even be remotely controlled, adding an extra layer of unpredictability. By 9:30 a.m., the first sounds of Karen's party began to drift across the property. Mark retreated to a carefully selected observation point, a small blind he had constructed years ago for wildlife photography. It provided a perfect view of the lake while keeping him completely hidden. The guests arrived much like the previous weekend, loud, oblivious, their expensive vehicles creating a stark contrast to the natural surroundings. Mark watched as Karen directed her friends, setting up elaborate lounging areas, positioning speakers, and preparing for what she clearly expected to be another carefree lake party. What Karen didn't know was that her paradise was about to become a nightmare. The first indication came around 10:45 a.m. A young woman in a bright yellow bikini was the first to spot one of the snakes. Her scream cut through the music like a knife, causing everyone to pause. Mark had positioned the first snake perfectly, partially submerged near a popular swimming area, just visible enough to create maximum panic. "Snake!" she screamed, scrambling out of the water with remarkable speed. Her panic was genuine, her terror palpable. At first, the other guests thought she was overreacting, but then another scream erupted from the far side of the lake, then another, and another. Mark watched with a sense of clinical satisfaction. Each scream was perfectly timed, each snake positioned to create maximum psychological impact. The remote-controlled models added an extra layer of terror, snakes that seemed to move of their own accord, sliding between rocks, appearing in unexpected locations. Chaos erupted. Expensive cocktails were abandoned, beach toys forgotten. The once pristine party devolved into pure pandemonium. His plan was working perfectly. The lake transformed into a scene of pure pandemonium. Guests who moments ago had been lounging with cocktails were now scrambling over each other in a desperate attempt to escape the perceived snake invasion. Inflatable pool toys were abandoned, designer swimwear became irrelevant in the face of pure terror. Karen's perfectly curated party was disintegrating before her eyes. Her expensive Bluetooth speakers, still blaring dance music, became background noise to the symphony of screams and splashing. People were leaping out of the water with such frantic energy that several expensive smartphones and designer sunglasses were lost in the chaos. Everyone calmed down, Karen shouted, her voice rising several octaves. But calm was the last thing anyone was experiencing. A group of young men who had been playing volleyball moments earlier now huddled together on the shore, their muscular bravado completely evaporated in the face of the seemingly endless snake invasion. One particularly realistic water moccasin replica seemed to drift closer to a cluster of terrified guests. A muscular guy in designer swim trunks let out a high-pitched shriek that would have been comical under different circumstances. Another guest, a woman in an expensive bikini, was hyperventilating, her perfectly applied makeup now a streaky mess of terror. Karen's attempts to maintain control were futile. She grabbed a long stick, attempting to prod at some of the snakes, only to have them seemingly move with an unnatural, almost intelligent precision. Mark, watching from his hidden vantage point, allowed himself a small smile. The remote-controlled models were working perfectly. The chaos reached its peak when one of the snake replicas appeared to swim directly toward Karen. Her reaction was everything Mark had hoped for. She let out a scream that seemed to combine pure terror with absolute disbelief. Jumping backward, she lost her footing and tumbled into the shallow water, her designer white swimsuit now muddied and wet. "Who did this?" Karen screamed, looking around wild-eyed. Her perfectly styled hair was now a tangled mess, her makeup running, her entire carefully crafted image completely destroyed. As the panic continued, some of the more rational guests began to realize these might be rubber snakes. The psychological damage was done. The party was over, destroyed by an army of incredibly realistic rubber serpents. When Karen finally spotted Mark watching from a distance, her face transformed. It went through several stages: confusion, recognition, and then a volcanic rage that seemed to generate actual heat. She began to wade out of the water, her movements awkward and furious. "You!" she screamed, pointing dramatically. Water dripped from her body, her designer swimsuit now clinging to her in the most unflattering way possible. "Did you do this?" Mark simply smiled and offered a mock-innocent shrug. His years of scientific precision met her emotional outbursts with a calm that seemed to infuriate her even more. The contrast was remarkable. Karen's complete emotional meltdown versus Mark's calculated composure. Around them, the last of the guests were gathering their belongings. Expensive beach towels were wrapped around shoulders. People were checking themselves for snake bites that didn't exist. The lake, moments ago a scene of supposed summer fun, now looked like the aftermath of a bizarre invasion. Karen continued to scream, her words becoming less coherent with each passing moment. Mark remained perfectly still, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The battle for the lake had been fought, and Mark had won decisively. The fallout from the rubber snake incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours, text messages, social media posts, and impromptu neighborhood gatherings transformed the story into local legend. Some neighbors found the entire saga hilarious, while others were scandalized by the elaborate prank. At the first homeowners association meeting following the incident, Karen arrived with a thick folder of complaints. Her designer outfit a stark contrast to her now legendary reputation as the lake party victim. She demanded an investigation, insisting that Mark had deliberately sabotaged her social gathering with what she dramatically referred to as a psychological terrorist attack. The association board listened patiently. Mark, dressed in his usual understated manner, sat quietly, allowing Karen to speak. Her presentation was a masterpiece of emotional storytelling, detailing the trauma of the snake invasion, the potential psychological damage to her guests, and the absolute violation of community standards. This man, Karen proclaimed, pointing directly at Mark, deliberately placed dangerous-looking objects in a shared recreational area, causing severe emotional distress. Mark's response was simple and measured. "The lake is not a shared recreational area," he stated calmly. "It is my private property, clearly marked with no trespassing signs. I was merely protecting my ecosystem from unauthorized use." The board members exchanged knowing glances. Many of them were well aware of Karen's tendency to push boundaries and Mark's reputation as a respected long-time resident with a background in environmental conservation. After a lengthy discussion, the board found no evidence linking Mark directly to the rubber snake incident. Without proof, Karen's complaints seemed like nothing more than wild accusations. Her credibility took a significant hit when several guests from the party began sharing increasingly comedic versions of the event on social media. Viral memes began to circulate. Screenshots of terrified partygoers became internet gold. One particularly popular meme showed a muscular man mid-leap with the caption, "When Karen's lake party goes wrong." Another featured a close-up of a rubber snake with the text, "Nature's bouncer." Mark's private lake returned to its previous state of tranquility. The ecosystem continued its delicate balance, undisturbed by loud parties or invasive human activity. Wildlife returns to their usual patterns, the otters once again playing near the eastern shore, birds resuming their morning songs. Karen's social standing in the neighborhood underwent a significant transformation. Her future party invitations became mysteriously scarce. The once popular socialite found herself increasingly isolated, her lake parties nothing more than a distant, snake-filled memory. Months later, Mark would occasionally allow himself a quiet chuckle when remembering the incident. He had not just defended his property, he had made a statement about respecting personal boundaries and environmental sanctuaries. The rubber snakes found a new home in Mark's study, mounted in a display case, a subtle reminder of the day he reclaimed his sanctuary. Each snake was a trophy, a testament to careful planning and psychological warfare waged with scientific precision. As for the lake, it remained Mark's true companion, pristine, peaceful, and now with a legendary story that would be whispered about in neighborhood gatherings for years to come. The end.